So thanks for having me here. This is a set of thoughts about how to reimagine the sort of joint business model, user experience, and recommender systems behind social media. And I think that, there was a huge amount of enthusiasm for social media at its dawn about 2 decades ago. And I think that is probably most visible in its relationship to culture and news. So there was a feeling that media had traditionally been controlled by a small number of gatekeepers, that this was really reducing the diversity of content and sort of the participation in the process. And social media has really opened that up. A lot more people are able to be heard by a lot more different communities. But that's not just true in like those kind of more visible aspects. It's also true in the way that social media has changed the productivity landscape. Things like GitHub and LinkedIn have broken down a lot of organizational silos that used to exist within companies, allowed people to collaborate more easily across those silos. That's kind of the organizational equivalent of the gatekeeper problem that existed in news and culture. And this aspiration actually has like a very deep history. There's a wonderful book called The Democratic Surround that I recommend to people. After World War II, there were a lot of theorists like Margaret Mead and Ted Nelson who basically thought that the reason why fascism had been so successful was that broadcast had sort of an authoritarian centralizing tendency, and that we needed to build like different kinds of media experiences that would get past this. So the term multimedia comes out of that from Margaret Mead. The idea of like hypertext and a lot of these sort of interneted cultural experiences come from the work of people like Ted Nelson. And they've allowed like a lot broader range of audiences to sort of like express themselves and self-actualize than was possible in the kind of like Leave It to Beaver, Walter Cronkite universe. And the way that they've done this is they've tried to replace like a relatively small number of professional editors with basically a bunch of ingested social signals that are then algorithmically processed. And often the word algorithmic sounds kind of scary, but like, a very simple algorithm that can be used actually not that ineffectively to process this is like the number of upvotes that something gets, right? So like that's just simple democratic procedure. Now, that's not actually the most effective procedure. It like runs into some issues, and there are better ways to do it than that. But like there's nothing kind of like mystical about this algorithmic nature to the processing. It's just trying to use a much broader range of more democratic inputs in order to organize content, instead of having it done by gatekeepers. Now, unfortunately, the algorithms that have been used have run into a number of challenges. This includes polarization and the creation of echo chambers. And we hear about that a lot politically, but I just want to be clear, this is not about like politics or whatever. It's really a property of the technology and the experiences people have with it. This has been happening within churches. It's been happening, as you probably all have noticed, within like crypto communities. Like there's a tendency to like set up the Bitcoiners versus the, like there's all these kind of like things that really have nothing to do with politics traditionally conceived, that are just a result of like the dynamics of the way that the technology engages people. There's issues of dis and misinformation. There's the sensitivity of these things to adversarial attacks. So there's a really nice set of research showing that like this idea of like the Great Firewall in China is like actually greatly overstated. Like yes, there's a certain amount of like straight up censorship, but that actually like most of the social control happens through flooding of the environment with content, or amplifying content, or when there is a moment of social coordination, distraction attacks. And all of those things are sort of taking advantage of various features of the technology rather than just like cracking down on the technology. And of course, there's also, partly in the mechanisms that are done to address these things, the concentration of a lot of power in a small number of people who control various non-transparent features of these algorithms. One recent thing that was reported on was that many of the far-right influencers who were welcomed onto X by Elon Musk, when they said things that were not to his liking, ended up seeing their traffic go down by several orders of magnitude and getting demonetized. So like that gives you a sense of how things with brand promises around various properties of speech, et cetera, features that are used ostensibly to deal with disinformation or whatever problems can be used just in like pretty straightforwardly authoritarian ways. And a final problem that has arisen from this environment is this notion of like social isolation, anxiety among young people. But that's not inevitable. And in fact, there are places that are actually much more digitized than the places that primarily consume these tools, and yet have not seen these problems nearly to the same extent, or in some cases, these problems have actually improved during the social media era. So Taiwan has come, for example, to be the second least polarized country in the world, despite being, by many measures, the most digitized country in the world. And despite having a lot of really deep social tensions, including a 3-week-long occupation of their national legislature. Japan has also been, surprisingly resilient, despite having a very digitized society in many ways. And they have a number of platforms that help scaffold this, like Smart News. I think people are starting to catch on to this. So Community Notes on X was inspired by two things within the Taiwan environment: the use of Polis consensus-based ranking system, and the distributed fact-checking COFAX ecosystem. And Community Notes has now become kind of like the gold standard for how to address these issues and is spreading to the rest of the platforms. But Community Notes is actually a very narrow functionality. It's for providing context, for potentially misleading posts. It doesn't actually drive the underlying engine of the recommendations in the first place. It's not very central to the user experience, and it plays no role in the business model. And so for all those reasons, it's like not really reshaped the fundamental nature of the social media experience. And there's a really interesting moment that we have right now. I think that, let's say that social media roughly started 20 years ago. I think this is the moment over those 20 years where it is most being disrupted, and there's the greatest fluidity. There's the TikTok ban issue and what's going to happen with that. There's a big exodus of people from X. There's the rise of a bunch of alternative platforms that Rene DeRest has called the Great Decentralization. And there's a bunch of court cases at the same time against these platforms. And because of the election and other things, a lot of them are changing the way they're approaching content moderation, and there's the entry of AI into the system. Okay, so what would a better state look like? If things are getting disrupted, if they're fluid, where could we take things? So I think this is going to be familiar to most people here, but I just want to briefly talk about Polis and v-Taiwan, as well as the engine behind Community Notes. So like the basic idea here is pretty simple. There's a notion of consensus across difference within a community. So basically, people are expressing their opinions are getting clustered, and then things that find agreement across things that are across groups that are usually divided, according to a variety of different algorithms, can be surfaced as things that are bridging. And this is related to another one of the like most important movements. If someone could tell me how much time I have, that would be great. 10 minutes? Okay. This is related to one of the most important movements, along with what Mead and Nelson did in the post-war era. So one reaction to the war was like, centralization causes fascism. But another reaction is that actually, if you look at long-term metrics on polarization and disinformation, They were actually worse before the Second World War than they are now. So those are like kind of the two local maxima, was like the 20 years before the Second World War and now. And after Pearl Harbor, basically there was a lot of fear that people were going to blame the US's lack of armament and preparedness for the war on this, and that all the media was going to get nationalized. And so they convened this thing called the Hutchins Commission, which was set up basically what became the like post-World War II journalistic ethics standards that led to this period that people perceive as having been much lower polarization and disinformation. And there's a bunch of stuff involved in that, but like the basic principles were that like you're supposed to put as news the stuff that people agreed on across the divides within society, and then you're supposed to, like in a balanced way, show the major opinion groups that existed in the opinion section. So like very simple ideas that are pretty familiar, but like this is actually what Polis and Taiwan are kind of doing algorithmically. They're like figuring out in a user-generated content, democratic input environment, what are the different opinion groups, what brings people together across the differences, and like what are representative opinions for the opinion groups. But the problem is that like that's for a single environment. But the whole point of social media is that there's lots of different audiences. There's like your university, community, and there's like the Ethereum community, and there's, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is, how do you do that in that setting? One way of conceptualizing this is Georg Zimmel's idea of intersectional identity. Every person is a part of a bunch of different communities, and your feed is going to like be coming from all those different communities that you're a part of. And this is a little bit like how in the analog world, you would subscribe to a bunch of different magazines. Like when I was a kid, our family would get like 10 magazines that represented different interests that the family had. And the idea here is that we could take the concepts underlying Polis, but apply them algorithmically to a diversity of communities that are detected by the system. And in fact, systems are already doing this. So like the way that you do targeted advertising is already that you like pick out communities that you want to target. But the thing is, that's not made transparent to the participants. So the notion is that we could define content within a community by the things that are unifying within that like subgraph. And then you could uprank that content and then have someone within their feed basically seeing content labeled by the communities within it which it's consensual, and the communities where it's divisive. And where it's divisive, you can click and see contrasting perspectives within that community from other points of view. And the idea is that rather than the customer for this just being advertisers, though advertisers have a role, a core customer would be the communities themselves. That they would pay, just like there's payment for public media, there's payment for, by Harvard University to print the Harvard University Press, et cetera. There would be payment by the communities to uprank within their community members' feeds the content that brings that community together or gives people a balanced understanding of that community. And that advertisers might also value advertising in the context of such unifying content because it gives them a chance to speak to a coherent audience as a whole in a way that allows them to define their brand. Almost all targeted advertising right now is like, go empty your shopping cart. It's like an individual purchase decision. But the most valuable advertising is not that. It's like Super Bowl ads that try to define a brand as being about sharing or as about independence and individualism or whatever. And that is not really possible if you don't know who else is consuming the content at the same time. 5 minutes or? Yeah, okay. That's the basic idea. This can apply in productivity networks to help people form groups across organizational boundaries. It can apply in news settings to help deal with division. And there's a lot of really interesting opportunities with Blue Sky that we're exploring. And it can also apply within cultural networks to try to create a sense of popular culture. Rather than you just being stuck to your phone and seeing videos that you find fun, you have a sense of like, who's going to this concert with you, or who's like into this thing, what's the subculture that it's defining with lunar punk or solar punk, I guess, et cetera. Okay, I think I want to stop there so I have time to answer a couple questions.
Hey, how do you see the integration of, I guess, pro-social media and things like cryptocurrencies, or Pooja's talking community currencies, these sorts of things? What, in your ideal sort of vision of these experiments, how would you see that integrating?
Yeah, I didn't get to talk too much about the economic side of this, but the basic idea is that people would, so when you create content that ends up getting like high ranked within the context of a community, in addition to like any payments you can get, and we can talk about the financial side of it, you would receive from that community some like reputational currency. And then when you want to post into the context of that community so that people see it at all in the first place, and therefore you get the chance to get the ratings from people that will then lead to upranking of the content, you can stake some of that community currency, and you'll get it back, you know, more than fully if it ends up doing well. But if it ends up being like, say, you know, unhelpfully divisive or not popular or whatever, then like you won't get that back. So the notion is like you have a community specific way to get things visibility in that community, and then if you sort of serve the goals of that community, you get, you know, that back with interest, basically.
Can I ask a quick question? So,
oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So you hinted earlier on these tools. Can you speculate for us on whether there's hope for them infiltrating more authoritarian regimes? You know, I don't have the
You mean like the United States or
all of them. Yeah. So is there hope?
Or
I mean,
X?
Sure.
Well, I think that there's still access to blue sky in the U.S. as far as I can tell, but no, I mean, like, I would love to see a project I've talked about is called Internet Free World. So, like, you know, there used to be Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe. They don't exist anymore as of a few weeks ago because of the decisions of some technology leaders. But I would love to see trying to create that environment for internet funded by free countries, such as they still exist. And I'd love to see that have a hardware component that is, you know, satellite-based and based on lightweight receivers, but also a software component with cryptography using some of these things. And we've been exploring that, but a lot of the traditional funding sources for that are not forthcoming now, and we'll see what happens to that. So.
I have a question about the governance of the algorithm and
Yeah.
sort of a plurality of that.
Yeah.
How do you envision making the black box less black, and then also empowering the user to understand these highly complex things under the hood, but still empower them to make a deliberate choice of which algorithm they may prefer, and any projects that do a good job here?
There's so much to say in response to that question that I don't think I really can do it in like a minute. I'd be happy to talk about it more. We talk about it in the paper. We're working on it as part of the project, but I don't think I can give a concise answer. Sorry.
We'll take two final questions, and then you can
Yeah.
answer both, and then we'll move on.
Hi. You talk a lot about the content and people watching content, but like before recommendation systems were invented, I personally read content from people because of the people, my friends,
Yeah.
like in Facebook or something. And the
Yeah.
content was not the best, but I was reading it because of the continuation of the relationship with
Yeah.
those people. And if I wanted like really good content of the top people, I read books.
Yeah.
And now it's kind of fucked up because I don't really want content. I want like reconnection with my friends.
Yeah.
Do you think like why that happened, and would we kind of come back or evolve to some
Well,
other?
I think that the bilateral relationship thing is real and has a role. But I think one thing that was really missing is that like people are not primarily about bilateral relationships. They're really about social context. There's like groups and like, you know, milieus, and a lot of those are hard to define. So like you don't just join a group or form a group, but they're like implicitly defined, and that's why we ended up in this algorithmic content space. And so I think like recovering that would be great through making more transparent to people those communities that are being identified. So, yeah.
Yeah, my question goes on a similar line. So when you were talking about communities, it was kind of making me wonder how you're defining communities.
Yeah.
Because I found it helpful lately to think of myself as a large language model trained on X, Y, and Z. How are you defining communities in this context? Is it like reading the same things? Is it like, yeah, maybe you might have said it and I missed it, but I would be curious about that.
Again, this sort of calls for a longer answer, but I'll try to answer concisely. To me, communities are defined by common knowledge. That's the idea, a set of things that everybody knows, and everybody knows that everybody knows, and everybody knows that everybody knows. So like, there's a language community because everybody knows that same language, and they know that everybody knows that, and they're sort of like, have that common understanding. So like, anyways, that is the conceptual framework that I use to think about community, but to explain what that means and go much beyond that, I think would take more time than I have, so thanks.
Thank you so much.